In today's episode, we follow a woman who watched one video and decided she could conquer Everest. She climbed higher than she ever should have, smiling and filming, convinced she was still winning. The decisions she kept making were so reckless that experienced climbers knew there was no way this was ending well. It was May 8th, 2018. The death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest had already seen unusual traffic that climbing season, with inexperienced climbers creating dangerous bottlenecks on the narrow ridge routes, where every minute of delay increased the risk of fatal exposure. The mountain's most treacherous section had become a highway of ambition, where climbers with vastly different skill levels competed for the same narrow weather windows that meant the difference between summit success and death. The 2018 climbing season had been marked by particularly dangerous conditions, with multiple fatalities already recorded due to overcrowding and inexperienced climbers attempting the summit without adequate preparation. Weather patterns had been unpredictable, creating shorter summit windows that compressed the climbing schedule and increased pressure on expedition teams to push clients beyond safe limits. The combination of commercial pressure and social media-driven adventure tourism had created a perfect storm of dangerous conditions on the world's highest mountain. Local climbing authorities had issued warnings about the increased risks, but the lucrative nature of Everest expeditions meant that many companies continued accepting clients regardless of their qualifications or the deteriorating safety conditions on the mountain. Bryn Castellano was 26, a social media influencer from Phoenix who had gained a substantial following posting fitness and lifestyle content. Her online presence featured daily workout videos, motivational quotes, and sponsored content for athletic wear brands that had made her a modest income in the competitive influencer marketplace. 3 weeks earlier, she had posted about watching a viral YouTube video of an Everest summit, announcing to her followers that this would be her next big adventure and the ultimate test of her fitness journey. The post had generated significant engagement from her audience, with thousands of comments expressing both excitement and concern about her ambitious plans. Her mountaineering experience consisted entirely of occasional desert hiking in Arizona, typically day trips to popular trails with established paths and minimal elevation gain. She had told friends and documented in her social media posts that her daily gym routine of cardio and strength training would be sufficient preparation for climbing the world's highest mountain. Her fitness content had focused on indoor workouts and lifestyle motivation rather than outdoor adventure or technical skills development. The highest elevation she had ever reached was approximately 7,000 feet during a hiking trip to Flagstaff, a far cry from the 29,032-foot summit of Everest that would require months of specialized high-altitude training and acclimatization. Her decision to attempt Everest had been impulsive, driven by the viral video's portrayal of summit success as the ultimate achievement for fitness enthusiasts. The video had shown dramatic footage of climbers reaching the summit with triumphant music and inspirational messaging, but had omitted the years of training, technical skill development, and mountaineering experience required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had interpreted the content as validation that physical fitness alone was sufficient preparation for the world's most challenging mountain. She had shared the video with her followers, adding her own commentary about how the achievement represented the perfect combination of mental toughness and physical conditioning that she had been developing through her fitness journey. The influencer culture surrounding extreme adventures had created a dangerous misconception that social media documentation was as important as proper preparation and safety protocols. Bryn had been influenced by other content creators who had attempted high-profile adventures with minimal experience, focusing on the dramatic visual content rather than the extensive behind-the-scenes preparation that successful expeditions required. Her content strategy had become increasingly focused on pushing boundaries and attempting more extreme challenges to maintain audience engagement and attract new followers in the competitive fitness influencer marketplace. Her preparation for the expedition had been entirely inadequate for the technical and physical demands of high-altitude mountaineering. She had spent only 2 weeks at a local climbing gym, learning basic rope techniques, and had completed a single weekend mountaineering course that covered elementary skills like crampon use and ice axe handling. Her physical training had consisted of increased cardio workouts and stair climbing exercises, but she had never experienced the effects of high altitude or practiced with the technical equipment required for Everest climbing. Bryn had maxed out multiple credit cards to pay for a budget expedition service, posting about her plans to reach the top of the world and document the journey for her followers. The financial strain of funding the expedition had required her to take on additional sponsored content and promotional partnerships in the weeks leading up to her departure. She had purchased climbing gear online based on equipment lists provided by the expedition company, arriving in Nepal with technical equipment she had never used in real climbing conditions. Her gear selection had been influenced more by aesthetic considerations for her social media content than by practical functionality and safety requirements for extreme altitude mountaineering. Her expedition leader had documented concerns about her lack of experience in his client assessment notes, noting her unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering equipment and techniques during the initial gear check. However, she had signed all required liability waivers and paid the full expedition fee, meeting the legal requirements for participation despite the guide's reservations about her preparedness for the technical and physical demands of the climb. The expedition company's business model relied on volume rather than client qualification, accepting anyone willing to pay the fees and sign the extensive liability documentation that protected the company from legal consequences of client injuries or deaths. Above 26,000 feet, climbers enter the death zone, where the human body begins dying from oxygen deprivation, requiring supplemental oxygen to maintain basic cognitive function and prevent fatal altitude sickness. May temperatures on Everest ranged from minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the day to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, with wind chill factors that could drop effective temperatures to life-threatening levels within minutes. The summit route required navigating knife-edge ridges with steep drops of thousands of feet, technical rock steps that demanded advanced climbing skills, and areas where fixed ropes provided the only protection against fatal falls. Weather windows for summit attempts typically lasted only a few hours before afternoon storms brought whiteout conditions, hurricane force winds, and rapidly dropping temperatures that could kill exposed climbers within minutes. The thin air at extreme altitude meant that even experienced mountaineers operated with severely reduced physical and mental capacity, making technical decision-making and equipment use exponentially more difficult than at sea level. Simple tasks that required seconds at sea level could take minutes or become impossible entirely in the death zone, where cognitive function deteriorated rapidly and physical coordination became severely impaired. The death zone earned its name because the human body cannot survive extended exposure to the altitude and conditions, with every hour spent above 26,000 feet increasing the risk of fatal complications, including cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, and complete cardiovascular collapse. The combination of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and technical climbing challenges demanded months of acclimatization training and extensive mountaineering experience for safe passage through the zone. Even experienced climbers typically spent no more than 12 to 16 hours in the death zone during summit attempts, as longer exposure guaranteed fatal physiological breakdown, regardless of fitness level or preparation. The commercialization of Everest had created a dangerous environment where expedition companies competed for clients by lowering experience requirements and safety standards. Budget operators often accepted climbers with minimal qualifications to fill expedition slots, relying on liability waivers and the assumption that guides could compensate for client inexperience. This practice had led to increasingly crowded conditions on summit day, where traffic jams in the death zone exposed all climbers to extended periods of fatal altitude exposure while waiting for inexperienced climbers to navigate technical sections. The economic incentives of the climbing industry had created a system where profit margins often took precedence over safety considerations, particularly for budget expedition companies competing against more expensive operators who maintained stricter client qualification standards. The psychological effects of extreme altitude also created dangerous overconfidence in inexperienced climbers, who often interpreted their survival of lower elevations as evidence of their readiness for the summit push. Altitude sickness could impair judgment while simultaneously creating euphoric feelings that masked the severity of physical deterioration, leading climbers to make increasingly poor decisions as they ascended higher into more dangerous terrain. The combination of oxygen deprivation and extreme physical stress often produced a false sense of invincibility that caused inexperienced climbers to dismiss safety protocols and ignore warning signs that would normally trigger immediate retreat to lower elevations. Multiple expedition companies had refused Bryn as a client due to her complete lack of mountaineering experience, a fact documented in email exchanges her family later recovered from her laptop. The rejection emails specifically cited her absence of high-altitude climbing experience, lack of technical mountaineering skills, and insufficient time for proper training as disqualifying factors for Everest participation. Several outfitters had recommended she gain experience on smaller peaks and complete mountaineering courses before attempting Everest, advice she had dismissed in favor of finding a company willing to accept her payment. The more reputable expedition companies required evidence of successful climbs on peaks above 20,000 feet, technical climbing certifications, and demonstrated competence with mountaineering equipment before accepting clients for Everest expeditions. The budget expedition company that eventually accepted Bryn had a questionable safety record and a business model based on accepting clients that other operators had rejected. Their marketing materials emphasized the adventure and achievement aspects of Everest climbing, while minimizing the technical requirements and safety considerations that made the mountain so dangerous for inexperienced climbers. The company's guides were often overloaded with too many clients to provide adequate supervision, particularly for inexperienced climbers who required constant monitoring and assistance with basic mountaineering tasks. During the acclimatization period at base camp, Bryn's inexperience became increasingly apparent to other expedition members and support staff. She struggled with basic tasks like adjusting her oxygen mask, properly securing her crampon bindings, and managing her gear in cold weather conditions. Other climbers on the expedition later reported that she had difficulty sleeping at altitude and showed signs of altitude sickness, even at the relatively low elevation of base camp. Her social media posts from this period showed her excitement about the adventure, but also revealed her lack of understanding about the serious nature of the challenges ahead. During the approach to high camp at 26,000 feet, her guide had noted in his daily expedition log that she struggled with basic equipment use, including crampon attachment, oxygen mask operation, and rope handling techniques that were essential for safe movement in the death zone. Her tent partner, another climber on the expedition, later reported that Bryn had spent the pre-summit rest period taking photos and posting to social media instead of sleeping and conserving energy for the demanding summit push. The rest period before summit attempts was critical for physical and mental preparation, as climbers needed to conserve every possible resource for the extreme demands of the death zone ascent. The night before the summit attempt, she had posted content showing her excitement about reaching the top, despite visible signs of altitude sickness, including headaches, nausea, and disorientation, that experienced climbers recognized as warning signs of dangerous altitude exposure. Her guide had noted her symptoms and recommended she consider descending rather than continuing to higher altitude, advice she had documented herself dismissing in her social media posts. The social media documentation had become more important to her than the safety recommendations, as she had promised her followers that she would reach the summit and document the achievement for their entertainment and inspiration. She had ignored multiple turnback recommendations from her guide at various checkpoints during the ascent, including the balcony at 27,600 feet, where many climbers abort their summit attempts due to time constraints or physical condition. Her phone recorded her dismissing physical symptoms, including severe headaches, difficulty breathing, and coordination problems that indicated dangerous altitude sickness progression. Each checkpoint represented a critical decision point where climbers needed to honestly assess their condition and abort the summit attempt if they were showing signs of serious altitude-related illness. During the final approach through the death zone, Bryn had fallen significantly behind the group pace, requiring frequent rest stops that consumed precious time during the narrow weather window. Her guide had repeatedly urged her to maintain the established climbing schedule, explaining that delays in the death zone exponentially increased the risk of fatal exposure when afternoon storms arrived. She had documented her struggles on camera, showing herself gasping for breath and stumbling on technical sections that experienced climbers navigated efficiently. The footage revealed her complete unfamiliarity with high-altitude climbing techniques. and her dangerous tendency to prioritize social media documentation over safety and efficiency. Other expedition teams passing her group had noted her obvious distress and questioned whether she should continue the ascent. Several experienced climbers had stopped to offer assistance and additional oxygen, concerned about her visible symptoms of severe altitude sickness and her apparent unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering techniques. Her guide had been managing multiple clients simultaneously and was unable to provide the constant supervision that her inexperience required in the technical terrain of the upper mountain. The guide-to-client ratio on budget expeditions often made it impossible to provide adequate supervision for inexperienced climbers who needed constant assistance and monitoring. Her social media documentation during the ascent showed increasingly erratic behavior and poor decision-making as altitude sickness progressed. Posts from higher elevations contained rambling captions and showed her removing essential safety equipment for better photo opportunities, behavior that experienced mountaineers recognized as clear signs of impaired judgment due to oxygen deprivation. The content she was creating for her followers was actively endangering her life, but the altitude had impaired her ability to recognize the growing danger. Her followers had been commenting with increasing concern about her appearance and behavior in the posts, but she had been unable to process their warnings due to her deteriorating mental state. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying these stories, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content like this. The pressure to create compelling content had become a dangerous distraction from the life or death decisions required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had been stopping frequently to film herself and document her experience, consuming valuable time and energy that should have been devoted to efficient movement and safety protocols. The social media documentation had become an obsession that overrode her survival instincts and prevented her from recognizing the severity of her deteriorating condition. Weather reports available to all expedition teams showed a narrow summit window with dangerous storm conditions expected by early afternoon, requiring climbers to reach the summit and begin descent by noon to avoid potentially fatal exposure. The forecast indicated rapidly deteriorating conditions with high winds and whiteout snow that would make navigation impossible and increase the risk of fatal exposure for anyone caught above the death zone during the storm. The weather window was particularly narrow that day, with meteorologists predicting that conditions would become unsurvivable for anyone exposed above 26,000 feet after 2 p.m. At approximately 27,800 feet, just 200 feet below the summit, Bryn became separated from her group while stopping to document her climb on camera for her social media followers. She had missed the established turnaround time by over an hour and continued climbing alone as weather conditions began deteriorating according to the predicted forecast. Her phone camera captured her stumbling repeatedly as she moved upward without her guide, showing clear signs of severe altitude sickness and complete physical exhaustion. The separation from her group had occurred gradually as she fell further behind, with her guide eventually losing visual contact during the deteriorating weather conditions. The incoming storm conditions reduced visibility to near zero within minutes as predicted, creating whiteout conditions where climbers could become lost within feet of established routes. During her struggle to continue upward, her oxygen regulator began malfunctioning, delivering inconsistent flow rates that she was unable to diagnose or repair due to her inexperience with the technical equipment. The combination of equipment malfunction and depleted oxygen reserves created a critical emergency that required immediate technical knowledge she did not possess. Her oxygen supply, which should have lasted until her planned descent, began running low due to the extended time she had spent in the death zone and the increased consumption caused by her inefficient climbing pace. Something was wrong with her breathing apparatus, but she was unable to take corrective action in her deteriorated state. The malfunction was a problem that experienced climbers knew how to prevent and fix, but Bryn had never encountered this issue during her limited training. As her oxygen supply became increasingly inadequate, Bryn's physical condition deteriorated rapidly in the extreme altitude and cold conditions. Her camera footage showed her becoming increasingly disoriented and unsteady, with her speech becoming slurred and incoherent as oxygen deprivation affected her brain function. The combination of severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and complete physical exhaustion created a cascade of life-threatening conditions that she was unable to manage. Her movements became increasingly erratic as hypoxia affected her motor control and decision-making ability. Unable to repair her oxygen equipment or locate her group in the whiteout conditions, Bryn collapsed approximately within 150 feet below the summit. She lay motionless in the snow, too exhausted to continue and unable to descend without assistance. The malfunctioning oxygen equipment provided insufficient flow to sustain life at that altitude, while the storm conditions made rescue impossible. The location where she collapsed was exposed to the full force of the incoming storm, with no natural shelter or protection from the elements. She attempted to call for help, but the extreme altitude and equipment failure had left her too weak to move or signal effectively. The combination of oxygen deprivation, hypothermia, and complete physical collapse proved fatal within hours. Her body was found in the same location where she had collapsed, with her malfunctioning oxygen equipment still attached. The investigation determined that inexperience with critical life support equipment had contributed to her death in the death zone. Bryn's guide discovered she was missing when his group reached the summit and began their mandatory descent to avoid the incoming storm. The guide had been managing multiple clients during the summit push and had lost visual contact with Bryn during the final approach, assuming she had turned back as recommended due to her obvious altitude sickness, symptoms, and missed turnaround time. The guide's primary responsibility had been to get his other clients safely to the summit and back down, making it impossible to provide the constant supervision that Bryn's inexperience had required. The search for Bryn was immediately hampered by the severe weather conditions that had been predicted for the afternoon, with the storm arriving exactly as forecasted and bringing hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made any search efforts impossible and extremely dangerous for potential rescuers. Severe weather conditions prevented immediate search efforts in the area where she had collapsed, as the predicted storm had arrived with hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made helicopter operations impossible and put ground search teams at extreme risk. The storm system lasted for 3 days, during which time any chance of survival for someone exposed on the mountain face was eliminated by the combination of extreme cold and wind exposure. Rescue teams were unable to access the area until weather cleared sufficiently for helicopter reconnaissance flights, and her body was located by aerial search at the location where she had collapsed, though recovery operations were deemed too dangerous due to ongoing avalanche conditions and the extreme altitude that limited helicopter performance. The medical examiner determined that Bryn died from a combination of severe altitude sickness, hypothermia, and oxygen deprivation caused by equipment failure and complete physical exhaustion. The investigation found evidence of her separation from the group and equipment malfunction that had contributed to her collapse. The investigation found that her climbing gear met safety standards, but noted that her inexperience with oxygen equipment, maintenance, and troubleshooting had been a critical factor in the fatal outcome. The case was classified as an accidental death with contributing factors of inexperience, severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and adverse weather conditions. Her family pursued legal action against the expedition company for accepting an unqualified climber, though the signed liability waivers complicated their case. Her social media accounts were memorialized by her family, who removed her final posts from the mountain and replaced them with warnings about the dangers of attempting extreme adventures without proper preparation. The expedition company faced minimal regulatory consequences and continued marketing to inexperienced climbers, promoting Everest as an achievable goal for clients with basic fitness and financial resources. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.